It was 1943, and somewhere over occupied Europe, a German pilot spotted something in his mirror. It was big, round-nosed, almost ungainly. He smiled. What he did not know was that the machine behind him had been built differently from anything that had ever chased him. It had been built to absorb punishment, to carry firepower, to hunt. What he did not know was that he was already dead. To understand why the P-47 Thunderbolt mattered, you have to understand how close the Allies came to losing the skies over Europe entirely. By the summer of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces had committed to a doctrine of daylight precision bombing. The idea was simple in theory. Fly high in tight formation, drop bombs on specific targets like factories, oil refineries, and rail yards, and crippled Germany's ability to wage war. In practice, it was becoming a catastrophe. The German Air Force had adapted. Luftwaffe pilots had developed tactics designed specifically to break apart American bomber formations. They flew head-on attacks. They used coordinated waves. Some carried rockets that could knock down a B-17 Flying Fortress from outside the range of its defensive guns. The losses were staggering. On October 14, 1943, the 2nd Schweinfurt raid sent 291 B-17 into the heart of Germany. 60 never came back. 229 were damaged. In a single afternoon, the 8th Air Force lost 600 trained airmen. Something had to change. The American answer was a fighter, one that could fly far enough into Europe to protect the bombers, one that could fight the Luftwaffe on equal terms. The Army Air Forces had already received a new aircraft from Republic Aviation. It was designed by a Georgian-born engineer named Alexander Kartveli. He had fled the Russian Revolution and arrived in America with one obsession: to build the toughest and most powerful fighter in the world. His creation weighed over 15,000 pounds when fully loaded. It had a radial engine so large it required an enormous barrel-shaped fuselage to house it. Pilots immediately nicknamed it the Jug, and the men who first flew it were not impressed. When the 56th Fighter Group received their first P-47s in early 1943, the reaction was not enthusiasm, it was confusion. In some cases, it was outright hostility. The machine in front of them was enormous by fighter standards. The cockpit sat so high off the ground that pilots needed a ladder to climb in. The engine was a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows. It displaced 2,800 cubic inches and produced over 2,000 horsepower. The fuselage surrounding it looked less like a fighter and more like a flying barrel. Experienced combat pilots looked at the P-47 and asked a serious question: how was this thing supposed to dogfight? The answer, in the beginning, was not very well. Early missions over Europe exposed a critical weakness. The P-47 was built for high-altitude performance, but at low altitudes below 15,000 feet, it struggled. The German Focke-Wulf 190 could simply climb above a P-47, build speed and energy, and disengage whenever it wanted. Or it could turn inside the bigger aircraft and force a slow turning duel that the P-47 could not win. German pilots learned this quickly. In fighter unit briefings across occupied France, Luftwaffe pilots were told not to worry about the new American heavy fighter. Avoid it if you like. Engage it on your own terms. Break off at low altitude if threatened. For the first few months of 1943, that advice worked. There was another problem: range. The early P-47 could barely reach the Dutch coast before it had to turn back to base. That left the bomber formations unescorted for the most dangerous part of their journey, the deep penetrations into Germany itself. The Thunderbolt had enormous power and 8 guns, but it could not get to the fight that mattered most. By the spring of 1943, Some senior Allied air commanders were quietly beginning to wonder whether the P-47 program had been a mistake. They would soon have their answer. The pilots who figured out the P-47 first were not the ones who tried to make it fly like something it was not. They were the ones who understood what it actually was. Colonel Hubert Zemke commanded the 56th Fighter Group. He was a lean, disciplined, and intensely competitive officer who had spent time before the war studying Soviet and German aviation. He brought that analytical mind to the P-47, and he started asking different questions. Not, why can this airplane not climb like a Spitfire? But, what can this airplane do that nothing else can? The answers, once found, were devastating. At high altitude, above 25,000 feet, the turbo supercharger gave the P-47 a performance edge over almost any German aircraft. The Focke-Wulf 190 in particular lost significant power at that altitude, where its own supercharger began to struggle. The P-47 kept climbing, kept accelerating, and kept fighting. In a dive, the P-47 was something else entirely. Its massive airframe and powerful engine allowed it to build speed at a rate that lighter German fighters simply could not match. A Focke-Wulf 190 or Messerschmitt 109 diving away from trouble would look back and find the gap closing, or gone. Zemke began turning these lessons into tactics. Dive, build speed, use the energy advantage, never try to turn with a German fighter, never choose to fight at low altitude, and above all, protect the wingman behind you. The 56th Fighter Group began to climb in the kill tallies. Francis Gabreski, Robert Johnson, and Dave Schilling became some of the highest-scoring American aces of the entire war, all flying P-47s with the 56th. Gabreski alone would claim 28 aerial victories in the Thunderbolt before the war ended. Johnson would claim 27. Johnson once survived a Focke-Wulf 19, emptying its guns into his aircraft at close range for 10 full minutes. His controls were wrecked, his canopy was shattered. The German pilot eventually flew up alongside him, looked into the cockpit, and simply turned away. He could not understand why the American was still in the air. Johnson flew the aircraft home. The Jug was learning how to kill, and its 8 guns were a large part of why. 8 Browning M, 2 machine guns, 4 in each wing, each one capable of firing 850 rounds per minute. Combined, the P-47's armament could put roughly 7,050 caliber rounds downrange every 60 seconds. A single 2-second burst from a well-trained pilot delivered approximately 230 rounds. The M2 Browning fired a round that could penetrate the engine block of a truck at 500 yards. Against aircraft, it shredded control surfaces, punctured fuel tanks, destroyed engines, and when it found the cockpit, it ended the fight in fractions of a second. The Focke-Wulf 190 carried 4 20mm cannons and 2 smaller machine guns. That was a fearsome battery that hit harder per round. In theory, the German armament should have been superior. In practice, the P-47's combination of volume of fire, accuracy, and the durability to stay in the fight long enough to use it told a different story. German pilots who had laughed at the fat American fighter began developing a new rule among themselves. Do not let it get behind you. And then, just when the Luftwaffe had begun to adapt to the P-47 as a high-altitude escort fighter, the Americans changed the game entirely. By late 1943, a decision had been made. The longer-range P-51 Mustang would take over the deep escort mission for the bombers. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its extraordinary durability and firepower, would be given a new purpose. It would go hunting, ground attack. The concept was brutally simple. Arm the P-47 with bombs and rockets in addition to its 8 guns. Send it low, fast, and low, over enemy territory. find targets of opportunity and destroy them. Locomotives, fuel trucks, ammunition depots, horse-drawn supply wagons, armored vehicles, airfields, radar stations. P-47 groups began flying missions that pilots nicknamed Chattanooga Choo-Choo. These were systematic sweeps across the German supply and transportation network throughout occupied Europe. The objective was to find anything that moved and stop it permanently. The P-47's durability proved decisive in this role. Ground attack flying means flying through ground fire, through anti-aircraft guns, through soldiers shooting rifles up from below, through hidden flak batteries positioned along rail lines and roads. Aircraft that were thin-skinned did not survive these low-level runs. The P-47, with its massive radial engine that could lose half its cylinders and keep running, absorbed punishment that would have destroyed most other aircraft. There are authenticated accounts of P-47s returning to base with cylinders blown apart, with oil streaming from shattered engine casings, with chunks of wing missing and tail surfaces riddled with holes, and still landing safely. Pilots sometimes stepped out of their aircraft and could not understand why they were still alive. Ground crews sometimes took one look at what had come back and could not understand how it had made it home. One story, repeated across multiple groups, describes a P-47 taking a direct flak hit that blew away most of one elevator. The pilot felt only a slight change in handling. He did not know how serious it was. He flew the aircraft home. When he climbed out and walked to the tail and saw what was left of it, he stood there in silence for a long moment. Then he patted the side of the fuselage and walked away without saying a word. The Jug took care of its pilots, and its pilots in return flew it into situations that no rational calculation said they could survive. For the German Air Force, the transformation of the P-47 from escort fighter to ground attacker created a strategic nightmare with no clean solution. When P-47s were flying high escort, German planners could predict their behavior, count their altitude, and plan interceptions accordingly. When P-47 groups began appearing low over France and Germany, coming from multiple directions at unpredictable times, the Luftwaffe's ground defense network struggled to respond quickly enough. German pilots who scrambled to intercept these low-level raiders faced a dangerous choice: pursue a P-47 that was already fast, already low, and already firing, or pull up and let it escape. Those who pressed their attacks at low altitude found themselves flying into exactly the environment where the Thunderbolt now owned the fight. The statistics tell the story more clearly than any single account. P-47 groups in the European theater destroyed over 9,000 enemy aircraft, both in the air and on the ground. They destroyed more than 86,000 railroad cars, more than 9,000 locomotives, over 6,000 armored vehicles. In the ground attack role alone, the P-47 accounted for more German equipment destroyed than any other Allied aircraft of the war. By 1944, German ground commanders were issuing orders to disperse equipment, avoid all movement during daylight hours, and camouflage supply columns under trees and netting because the American fighter bombers were everywhere. The German word for fighter bomber was Jabo, and that word, among German soldiers on the ground in France and Germany, had become a word that carried genuine fear. The pilots who had laughed at the fat American fighter in 1943 were either no longer laughing or no longer flying. When the guns fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the ledger was extraordinary. More than 15,000 P-47 Thunderbolts had been built. It was the most produced American fighter of the entire war. 15 fighter groups in the European theater flew it. Across all theaters of the war, including Europe, the Pacific, and the China-Burma-India theater, the P-47 had fought on every major front. The numbers are almost hard to comprehend. Nearly 750,000 combat sorties. Roughly 12,000 enemy aircraft destroyed across all theaters. The ground attack record, the locomotives, the rail cars, the fuel depots, the troop concentrations directly shaped the battlefield conditions that made the Allied advance across France and Germany possible. General Dwight Eisenhower, assessing what had made the Normandy invasion survivable and the subsequent breakout possible, cited Allied air supremacy as the decisive factor. The P-47, more than any other single aircraft, had created that supremacy over the battlefield. And yet, history remembered the P-51 Mustang. The Mustang was elegant, fast, visually striking. Its silhouette became the face of American air power in popular culture, in books, in films, in documentaries. The P-47's barrel-chested profile was less photogenic, less romantic. The Mustang got the glory. The Thunderbolt got the job done. The men who flew the Jug knew the difference. Robert Johnson, asked late in his life about the legacy of the Thunderbolt, said simply that he trusted that aircraft with his life every day for 2 years. He said no aircraft ever made him feel safer in a fight. Coming from a man who had survived being shot up by an enemy fighter for 10 straight minutes and still flown home, that was not a statement made lightly. The aircraft itself continued in service for decades after the war. Exported to dozens of nations, it flew in conflicts in South America, in Asia, and in the Middle East well into the 1960s. The last operational P-47 flew a combat mission in 1967. Nearly 25 years after the design first entered combat over the English Channel. Today, fewer than 15 airworthy P-47s remain in the world. Each one is irreplaceable. Each one represents a design philosophy that valued toughness over elegance, firepower over finesse, and survival over beauty. A philosophy that reflected something true about the nation that built it. There is a question worth sitting with. Why do we remember the beautiful weapon and forget the effective one? The P-51 Mustang is in films, on bedroom walls, and in every documentary list of great aircraft. The P-47 Thunderbolt, which destroyed more German equipment, flew more sorties, and arguably contributed more to the outcome of the ground war, exists mostly in the memories of those who flew it. Perhaps it is because the Thunderbolt's story does not fit neatly into the mythology we prefer. It was not the fastest. It was not the most maneuverable. It won through sheer resilience, through the ability to absorb punishment and keep fighting, through durability rather than elegance, and persistence rather than grace. And that perhaps is exactly why it matters. Because in war, as in most things that actually count, what survives is not the most beautiful. It is the most durable. It is the thing that was built to last, the thing that can be hit hard over and over again and still find the way home. The German pilots who laughed at the Jug in 1943 were not fools. They were experienced, they were dangerous, and they were right about many of its weaknesses. They just did not live long enough to see what it became. If this aircraft story means something to you, if you believe that the overlooked and the underestimated deserve their place in history, share this documentary. The pilots who flew the Thunderbolt earned that much.